Uh, I'm sure many of you are joining from your home as well. Thank you for making time for us today. And we're really excited about some of the things that we've learned over the last few months. I think as we get started here today, it's important to recognize that the situation we're in today is very different from one that we were in the last time we had a webinar on virtual engagement. And across the country and across the organizations we work with, people are waking up to the need to recognize the historic injustices done to the Black community and systemic racism as a problem in America. And with that, a whole new wave of engagement needs and challenges have emerged. So if you're a communicator or an engagement professional during this time, these are two career-defining challenges. And it's really an unprecedented moment. And so we feel a lot of things right now, but one of them certainly is privileged to be able to help or to try to be in a position to support you through these challenges. And what we'll cover today is a lot of the things that we're seeing across the organizations we work with, and also the things that you said in the national survey that we did in terms of listening to how engagement's changing for you. It's a situation we've never found ourselves in before, and some major fundamental changes are happening beneath our feet. So it's important to recognize that, and as organizations, as people, be open to those changes and welcome a new chapter in local government history and really in how we as organizations serve people. So we'll with that jump into our presentation today. I think Graham's going to kick it off for us, and certainly has a couple quotes here to share from the outreach that I think set the tone for today.
Yeah, thanks, Jay, and I really appreciate you taking the time to make that statement up front. I think now it's just an absolute critical time to keep that momentum moving. So it's important. Thanks for bringing it to the forefront. I want to start with a quote. Normally, in these types of situations, in these types of webinars, there's a lot that we have to say, but in this particular one, we're going to rely on what really all of you who are attending today and who participated in this survey said. I'm going to read it so that I don't misquote, but it starts with every single thing we thought we knew about engaging with residents is suddenly upside down and sideways. It goes on to say remote working and homeschooling have meant huge challenges in daily routines and habits. We have to start over, even in just trying to get the right information out to the right people at the right time. And unless we have the information and support we need from the top down, our credibility will be permanently damaged. And that's the last thing we need as a local government. And I take sort of three things from that quote. The trying, right? That is really what we've heard in sessions and webinars and roundtables over the last 3 months. Now is a time when we didn't have the answers. We are all trying. And so that's the first part of this that is most important, trying new things, getting better at what we have been working on for a while in such a short period of time, and then achieving support from the top down. And that's really what we hope to do today, is to provide information, to provide data points that you can bring to your decision makers, to leadership, to elected officials, to hopefully get some support from that top down. Because at the end of the day, really, it is credibility that we're hoping to preserve. Public agencies, local governments, these are the places where people need to trust, need to turn, and we need to be able to provide the tools, right, to find that information. So we embarked as a result of this on, right, this nationwide listening effort. One of the core values of our company, I think I've mentioned this in the past, but one of the core values from the beginning has been to listen intently, and that is really what our platform in its entirety has been built on, listening to what people need in the moment and trying to find a solution that can build towards a better overall approach. And I want to say that with this particular initiative, over 120 different agencies participated. We heard voices from every corner of the US and also up in Canada as well. So really a profound thank you for taking the time to contribute. Without those voices, without your experience, we really don't have much to go on. So this listening serves really two purposes. One, like I mentioned, to guide our product development roadmap. Jay oversees our product team. It is what we focus on first and foremost here, building technology that can help. But at this moment, what we're going to do is share this information with you as well. That's sort of the second and equally important aspect of such listening efforts. We want to be a place where you can turn to see what your peers are doing, to share information across the country and across Canada that is not necessarily easy to figure out because it's not been done before in a time like this. So really thank you for taking the time to participate in this, and hopefully there are some things that you can take away to your leadership. We'll talk about the specifics in a second, but I think it's important to say broadly, one of the things we noticed with all the responses and all the answers to the various questions that we asked and the comments we received was an interesting cycle. A lot of you expressed the need right now to engage more than ever, right? Whether it's police reform, whether it's COVID-19 responses, equity in the process, all of those external stressors are pushing many of you to look for tools to use as you go digital. You're not able to use those traditional methods. So we're kind of at an impasse, right? These are career defining challenges. And really there's two of them at the same time overlapping that are presenting themselves. So in that search, right, and trying to figure out what that tool is or adapting new processes to the tools you have, you're being distracted. And this is what we heard from the effort to offer consistent quality engagement, relationship building, reliable resources. And so that restarts the cycle. We heard several times, that these are efforts that are really taking away from the bigger picture of communication. What we'll do though is dive in at bigger picture, kind of defined, dive into some of the survey results specifically. I know that's why a lot of you are here, and we do have some really interesting information to share. The top level, high level stuff that we saw, I think can probably be assumed. We are seeing delayed or paused projects across the board. We're seeing that equity and due process, especially with regards to virtual meetings, are in question. The effectiveness of common outreach tactics, are they being utilized in the right way to reach, like our quote earlier said, audiences all over? And what is the future of a public meeting and virtual tactics with that in that regard? What is the next normal? And I know that term has been thrown around a lot, and we're going to adopt it, but the future of public engagement, how do you see it as experts, as people who are doing this every day? So the first question we asked was, have you been able to engage the public on your projects during COVID-19? So since March, mid-March, when we all came to the realization that this is just going to be a different landscape entirely, what does that look like? And 2 out of 3 said, yes, we have paused or delayed projects altogether. So almost half said something has been delayed, but 1 out of 5 said everything, just across the board. We have to stop until we can figure out a new way to approach this. And if we dive in a little bit more deeply on this, there were a couple of reasons. The first was a reliance on in-person public meetings. There was no question that the traditional method of public hearings, public meetings, comment collection, being put on hold really threw everybody off. But next in line was technology presenting hurdles. There are a number of anecdotal stories that we got from city councils and IT staff having to coach those councils as to how to use video conferencing software such as Zoom, how to adopt those platforms to a council hearing or a planning commission meeting where there were votes taken and public records that needed to be kept. Those are hurdles that were really difficult to overcome and cost a lot of time for staff and the other aspects of the consultants that work on these types of projects. But also, and this is one we'll expand on a bit, uncertainty in general about compliance with meetings and records laws. We had some webinars maybe a little over a month ago now, where we spoke with Dan Beverly of the National Freedom of Information Coalition. We've also heard from the UNC School of Government and various law firms on their take on this. But what we saw in the bigger picture was that organizations are having to choose between security and accessibility. We all knew that Zoom bombing became a real buzzword early on because we didn't see the opportunity, right, for people to just come in and derail a meeting. But then at the cost, right, of Zoom fixing those problems or using other platforms that required passwords and other protective measures, we lost that accessibility that is really a cornerstone of virtual or of public meetings in general, since, Greek times. That has been what we relied on. And I mentioned Dan from the National Freedom of Information Coalition. He came on a webinar with us, like I said, a month or so ago, and offered some really interesting insights with regards to public records and open meetings. He said, really what we need to do is utilize technology to replicate and improve the administrative process. And I'll insert a part that he said later. This is rather than reinvent. We're not here to reinvent the public process. We need to replicate it as best we can and improve on it. And then we need to embrace that cultural change in how we manage public engagement meetings and how public information records are kept when we're using these types of tools. So there's a big focus on our end as a result of guidance from people like Dan to really try and replicate these public meetings and provide not just security and accessibility at the same time, because that was the challenge up front that we heard. We're having to choose between one or the other, but also really looking for other benefits. When you bring technology into the picture, we're seeing that also legal benefits can be found in the protection you receive when records are kept. So due process, of course, when we're talking about a public hearing, and knowing that we can protect ourselves, right, and the decisions we make when someone opposed, right, may try to bring a lawsuit and say, well, I didn't have a fair opportunity. The law firms that offered guidance on this said, when you provide multiple and redundant ways for the public to participate, not just signing into a WebEx call, not just sending a written comment, and not just maybe a teletown hall, but multiple and redundant ways, you protect yourself from that opportunity for litigation, for projects to be slowed down or even derailed, right, as a result of legal challenges. Political, I think that one's a little bit more transparent, right? We all know that when you have better participation, when you have more voices at the table, right, that correlates pretty directly with the level of trust in these institutions. And at the local level, as we heard in that first quote, that's really where we have to be the most aggressive in transparency and communication, because this is where decisions impact people's lives immediately. So all of you know the importance of the decisions you make and how quickly those can make an impact. We also looked at technological improvements, and when we talk about technology as a company, we look at data, right? Data management. And so the ability to say, all right, we know, right, that when we're using technology wisely, when we're applying these systems to gather public feedback, to communicate in response, all of those things are by definition recorded. They're timestamped, they're cataloged, and then they're more available, right? To make sure that if we have these public records requests, if we have these needs to defend ourselves, they're there, and they're allocated to meetings, they're allocated to projects and decisions, because that's how the technology stack that you look to works. It organizes data. Lastly, savings. There is, we referenced in the last webinar, a documented savings of almost 50% from the Florida Department of Transportation when they went to virtual meetings. And that was because of course, the time that people have to spend commuting and the cost of renting rooms at various places, community centers. Those things can be redirected to the softwares and to the staff to implement these types of things. So a variety of opportunity has arisen from what we've seen and people talking about their experiences with technology in general for this current crisis. There are opportunities that we can take with us and move forward. The second question that we asked was, what methods have you used to reach and engage the public? It's an interesting answer, I think, because not only is it predictable in that online and virtual public meetings cleared the table with regards to how many of you relied on that, needed that, and had to make a shift because it wasn't something that you had in your playbook beforehand. So 91.5% of you said that was what we looked to reach and engage the public during the last couple of months. It was followed second by email, third by website updates. Commonality we noticed in this was that every one of these, with the exception of text message and SMS at the far end there, assume that people have access to some form of internet, some form of smartphone, some form of technology. And it's a very interesting correlation to the second question we asked, because we said, what concerns do you have for the future of public engagement? And everyone saw the writing on the wall. We're relying on online tools, virtual public meetings, which normally, right, as we had assumed early on, require a Zoom, a WebEx, a GoToMeeting, some form of software application, some form of broadband internet. So ensuring representative and equitable engagement was the highest ranked concern among all the responses we got. That followed quickly by maintaining and building relationships with residents, going back to that trust, going back to that need to be a source. So when we say ensuring representative and equitable engagement, knowing that we have shifted to online and virtual meetings, a majority of us looking to that, some of the quotes we saw, some of the comments we received really dug into the specifics of the challenge, right? We have a very rural county. A lot of residents do not have reliable access to the internet, creating a challenge to ensure that everyone has access to public hearings and a chance to comment. I'm going to take a second to back up and make known that the broadband challenge that we face as a country has been exposed more than ever. Previously, I worked with a regional consulting planning and engineering firm, and a number of years ago at this point, we were looking at grants and opportunities to expand broadband. And as a company, we looked at trying to make sure that that would fit right with the business model that we had, so that we could actually be profitable and do that work. And the grants, they had not reached that sort of, I guess, critical mass where we were able to say, this is a place where we can hire experts and we can put effort. The business model was very hard to make with regards to focusing on expanding broadband access. I would argue that right now, there has been no bigger discussion. I was looking on LinkedIn just a little while ago, and friends from an MPO out in the western part of North Carolina were mentioning just this morning, the broadband divide has been exposed now more than ever before. There is no question that we have a challenge to overcome. But more than broadband and internet access, another quote really underscored a different type of person that we need to engage. And that's not just people who have internet access, but who are not following local government communications. And we want to make sure that when we talk about accessibility and equity in the process, we're looking at people who are, of course, of a diverse background, ethnicity, racial backgrounds, and socioeconomic backgrounds, educational levels. Those types of people all have different types of jobs, and it's not enough to assume that everybody is available to be in front of a laptop, to be in front of even their smartphone for a public meeting at the times that we're used to hosting them. There are third shift, fourth shift workers who are going to be asleep, right, when we are looking to have these types of interactions. There are logistics truck drivers. There are people who make our country spin that are working when we're assuming that they can be a part of these conversations. So that's really where we have to employ those other aspects of engagement, noting that text messaging was the lowest of the options that we offered regarding engagement. This is a common statistic that we throw out there, but 20% of Americans rely on mobile phone data for internet. That means that they don't have broadband, they don't have a laptop, they simply use their data plan from Verizon or AT&T or whoever to be connected. And 90% of people who get text messages read them within the first 3 minutes. So we have people owning smartphones or cell phones. I mean, 95% of the country owning a cell phone, right? So that means that we have incredible reach when we adopt tools like text messaging, and they are immediate. Regardless of who you're trying to reach, they are immediately in the hands of those people. So we look at that as an opportunity really to bring in that mixed mode that you've probably heard us talking about, and that Jay will elaborate on a little bit more. When we talk though about virtual public meetings, knowing that that is a critical aspect of compliance and public and meetings laws, there are challenges, right? We can't assume that we'll have a meeting and just have text messages as a part of the process for people to participate. We can't assume that people can just join a WebEx or a Zoom call. So one of the things that, and we'll touch on this as a company briefly and then move back into the survey, one of the things that we built out, and a lot of you have talked with us over the past few months in regards to, is an online public meeting that is broadcast or live streamed for all to see, but kept separate from the that meeting that you and your commissioners or your stakeholders are having, really to create that access control and that protection of your meeting, while also open access and public comment management that is so important to open government, to public records laws. And so one of the things that we like to talk about in all of these discussions is the need to, when we have public meetings, underscore the importance of your video conference with other tools to allow people to participate from outside of those rooms. So a multi-channel public access, like phone, email, online comments, all of them being connected to your meetings. And that, like I said, is getting back to that mixed mode engagement, where we see the research coming out of a lot of the publications saying that when you use a variety of different methods, you can optimize data collection and reduce survey error. So there's an inherent bias when people respond only via a telephone survey or only via email or only coming to a meeting. That's a certain type of person, regardless of whether or not you invite a diverse group. And of course, it increases participation among rural residents because we know that they are access to limited broadband, and they're really generally going to be working different types of jobs, not necessarily tied to computers or to their inbox. And of course, better engagement in older populations as well. There is a technological divide. It is shrinking. I was corrected on a webinar a little while ago by a colleague who is over 65 and who is leading the charge on some of these online meetings. And so I have to be very aware that it is not a blanket statement. But many older generations struggle with online engagement and the tools that we're relying on. So we have to make sure that we're looking to all of these different methods when we talk about equitable and representative engagement. One of the last survey questions that we asked was, are you considering any in-person meetings in the next 2 months? And we said that because we saw the challenges. We know that everybody is looking for that opportunity to return to what was. We need to know whether or not we can get back to the normal. We can bridge those gaps where people are not able to come to our online meetings. We can understand better who we see because they're in person, and we can hear from them and attribute their comments. So all of us are anxious to get back to in-person meetings, traditional town halls. But the truth is, it's a broad swath of uncertainty. 33% or 32% of you said no, just flat out. We're not going to return to face-to-face meetings in the next 2 months. So we asked this about, say, a couple of weeks ago, so the next month and a half anyway, through the summer. No. Another 32% said we're not sure. We just don't know. 36% encouragingly said yes, but digging into some of the comments around that, reasons why included, of course, fear of the virus, public health concerns, noting that we just don't know if it's safe yet to return to that normal. And the other reasons included preferring the convenience of engaging virtually. There have been some tremendous benefits to that redirection of efforts to a virtual engagement platform where people are able to participate wherever, whenever. And lastly, this could last a while. And I would take that as a direct quote, because as we all see, states are seeing rises. Some states are seeing steady increases. Some states are seeing reductions in new virus identification. But ultimately, we just don't know how long this will take. And so we want to be prepared. We want to make sure that regardless of what the next steps are with reopening, with state laws or federal mandates, whatever those are, we need to be prepared. And so we got this quote from a planner up in Massachusetts who put it pretty well. Until we know when the public is allowed to enter and how many people will be allowed, they continue to hold virtual meetings. And we really do, I think, want to amplify that message. We don't know. There's a very popular, a lot of you are very familiar with this. The OODA Loop is a commonly known strategy. The Air Force uses it all the way down to businesses. And I want to draw a parallel where we are. Currently, we've gone through one cycle of the OODA Loop. We all sat in mid-March, early April, and observed for a moment and just said, okay, what are we seeing? What's this doing to our environment as we know it, right? Being turned upside down and sideways. So then we had to quickly orient. Personally at our company, that meant building out new platform capabilities like virtual public meetings to orient ourselves to the new challenge. And then it was on you all to decide, right? What is the next step? How are we going to address this? And as we saw in those survey results, a lot of you said virtual public meetings are where we're going to have to go. A lot of you said we're going to have to rely on emails and website updates far more. So acting, right? We all made those decisions. We've had a moment to act and implement these. And that's really where this survey comes. We've seen those actions, and now we're stepping back and observing again. We're at that point where we need to see what's next, that next normal. And the thing I want to point out that I think is really important in this is that nowhere in this circle does it say return back to what we were doing before. There is never a return to the original action that we were taking. Our good friend Kirsten Wyatt, the executive director at Engaging Local Government Leaders, had a really insightful thought on this the other day. And if any of you are familiar with engaging local government leaders, you'll know that they are just constantly updating their content, their resources. We couldn't be more proud to be a part of that and supporting them and the resources that they provide for local government leaders. So here's a quick plug for Kirsten and her group. They are really an invaluable resource. And she said, some bells cannot be unrung, which I really thought had a nice ring to it, to be a little bit lame. But out of necessity, government organizations are adopting more virtual tactics and are getting the opportunity to strategize with them. And so I want to interject here. I sat in on a webinar with the Davenport Institute, the Pepperdine University. So Ashley LeBosier is the director over there, and she's another thought leader in this community engagement space that's really just diving into the research and to the information that we need to make decisions. And one of her takes in a webinar was that this is a time to try things. This is a time and an opportunity, right, to learn new ways to engage. And there's almost a little bit of leeway in how you can apply these technologies. And so Kirsten's thoughts echo that. Here's an opportunity to strategize with them. So now that these options are available to community members, they're going to expect them in the future. They're going to expect that we're going to meet them where they are. They're going to say, well, what happened to those virtual meetings where I was able to call in and listen, and if I wanted to, I could leave a voice comment and that would be put into the public record. I wasn't able to be at my computer. I wasn't able to be at town hall, but I was really appreciative of that chance. There's no going back likely to what we were doing before. I like to point out people who make me proud. Another city, friends of ours over in Asheville have adapted exactly this. They are moving all of their meetings to virtual meetings in the understanding that they just don't know when there will be an opportunity to go back. So even if council or commissioners are able to be back in the same room, we have to recognize that people are not necessarily comfortable with going back out into large groups. It's one of those difficult to take temperatures, right, of the public sentiment. We have to respect that there's just a general discomfort in public gatherings. We see that in the lack of concerts across the country. We see that in the lack of sporting events. The NBA going back on its decision to maybe continue its season, even if it was in a controlled environment like at Disney World. NASCAR going and having all of their races with no attendees. The NHL having a truncated season and doing the same thing. We know that the public is not ready for this. Whether or not the laws say you can have a public meeting, we have to provide those opportunities for people to participate. And I want to point out, for the purposes of this webinar, our friend Montana's last name is grayed out because this is an actual comment that was actually received the other day at the City of Asheville's City Council meeting. So appreciate the city allowing us to share some of their success. They've been a really wonderful group to work with.
Absolutely.
I, though, would like to offer Jay the chance to talk about some of the exciting things we've seen. And he's got some data that he's pulled together from our platform specifically. So Jay, if you're still there, I might hand the screen back over to you.
That's perfect. Yeah, and actually we can stay on that Asheville slide for a second. I think an anecdote that's really fascinating from their experience, and one thing I'll speak to with a couple more data points here in a moment, is the sheer volume of voice comments they received at the last couple of city council meetings. And this is an experience I'm sure many of you have had in terms of recently with public hearings and creating space for public comment. People want to be heard. And in Asheville's case, I think 2 weeks ago, their council public hearing, they opened it up to do voicemail comments in addition to live 3-minute comments. They received, I believe, over 40 hours of recorded comment. So just from a sheer desire to be heard perspective, people are finding an outlet and finding ways to communicate their voice. And in Asheville's case, they've got the technology to manage that. The transcription of all those 40 hours, while transcriptions aren't perfect, at least gave them the opportunity to do a little bit of text analysis and understand where people are coming from. So it's a really interesting case study for sure. And I think segues nicely into the next kind of data point that we're looking at. So because public input has a suite of in-person meeting tools, including ways to take attendance and kind of do in-person participation, we were actually able to go back pre-COVID and get a good apples to apples comparison of attendees at these meetings. And so we took a sample of 217 pre-COVID meetings that had high quality attendance data that we knew was pretty comprehensive. And we took an average of those. We saw about 39 people on average coming to these in-person meetings. Of course, you've got some on the other end of the spectrum where it's 4 or 5 folks showing up, but and large meetings. Same thing's true for virtual, but the scale is entirely different. Some virtual meetings having up to like 2,000 attendees, but overall the average number of attendees increased by a factor of 240%. So by creating space for people to access the public process in ways other than having to show up in person, we reached many more people, and we were able to provide avenues for those people to access the public process. And this stats across the first couple months of virtual meetings, 95 virtual meetings held in April and May. So really proud of the work of the organizations that are doing this. I think it was over 35 or so organizations that launched virtual meetings on public input in the last couple months. And behind those 95 public meetings, there are actually, I think, like 280 something practice meetings. So kudos to everybody looking to get better and build their skill set with the virtual side of things. Either way, seeing these kind of numbers is exciting. And I think it's a sign of where engagement's going. So up next, we'll talk about kind of what is the quote next normal look like with this. And caveat, I don't really like the phrase next normal. I'm not sure if we'll have a new normal or a normal again for a long time. So this is, where is engagement going? That's really the way to think about this. The great part is we're seeing some aspects of in-person being assembled. So if you have a small group that's able to socially distance, the public isn't attending, but council might be set up in a socially distanced fashion. That aspect of meetings we think will return sooner than the public aspect of meetings. But ultimately, based on what we're seeing and the responses we heard from you in this survey, we see virtual kind of becoming the primary format for a lot of these meetings, with the potential to supplement that with an in-person component. So if you want to have a voice, here are the different avenues for having a voice. By the way, it's 18 months into the future, and now we can all get back together again. You're welcome to show up to the committee meeting in person as well. The mixed mode elements of that are really becoming the default that we're seeing. So providing ways for people to participate, just like we're seeing today. There's a few different ways to provide a comment, such as email, calling in and recording a voice comment. We'll probably see a return of paper surveys if there's some in-person elements or things that are mailed out. But ultimately, this mixed mode, kind of different approaches, not only is statistically more valid, but it's also just more equitable. And organizations are seeing that and making that shift. So the other side of this is, because all of this is virtual, everything can be better quantified and understood. We can see on a map who we're reaching and who's attending, and we can understand who we're missing through that. And so in a way, this has enabled more organizations to make a shift towards a more defined process. And that process is bringing sanity for a lot of folks. And I think we're not going to see a return to the pre-process engagement, where it was, hey, do whatever works. We'll try these different things. And each time we do it, it's a little different. And now there's no really hard set rule for how to do this part. Organizations are going to be finally bringing process to the last corner of the work that's really been the focus of process orientation. So the virtual shift enables that, and we think that'll stay. And so lastly, the relationship management aspect of this becomes paramount. As we're seeing with organizations like Asheville or Charlotte or Virginia Beach and others who not only have adopted the virtual meetings aspect, but do engagement on a unified platform like public input, you're able to start connecting the dots across these interactions. So being able to understand one person across different meetings, different online surveys, different transactions with the organization, that relationship can come into like one central place where we can understand people better and ultimately be able to communicate differently and communicate in a way that better matches their interests and their needs. So ultimately, that's the resident database aspect of this. And we think digital relationship management is really taking off throughout all of this. So the next chart, this one's a fun one. Well, it's fun as long as you don't have to manually read all these comments, which everybody's got a little bit of a different thought on how much we need to read every single comment, or if we need to try to summarize them for council and other stakeholders. But what this chart is showing us is total comment volume by month. So we're quantifying that by number of characters. We've got another chart for the number of comments themselves, but just last month, we saw a 10x increase in the number of comments. So from an average about 8,000 comments a month on the platform to over 80,000, so 83,000 comments received. And if you look at the number of characters there, it's enough to fill like Homer's Odyssey, I think 23 times over. And so what does that mean, right? Like, oh, lots of comments. What we're seeing, and I think what all of you are feeling, is that people want to be heard. People are at home, they're out of work, they're in a situation where they've been either cooped up or unemployed for weeks now. And people are waking up to the realities of injustice and of the challenges that are facing our communities. And so they're frustrated. They have a desire to have a voice in this process, and they're finding outlets for that. And the organizations that are able to adapt and listen will be able to build trust with those people, with all of our communities that want to be heard, that are finally showing up into this process in a way that we can start to make changes. But ultimately, that jump is just one way of quantifying a need that is totally unprecedented, and that we see more organizations looking to figure out ways to address that. So our goal at Public Input is to help you as an organization tackle these challenges head on, having those conversations about policing, about race, about equity, having conversations about reopening. All of these things are happening across the platform right now, and providing an outlet for people to be heard. And then not only providing that outlet, but being able to understand what people are saying and take action. That's really what we're passionate about helping you do. And so the next elements of this will continue to evolve, but we think the overall impact of what's happening right now is that participatory and collaborative democracy are really evolving, and they're becoming more of the defined default way that we listen to people. And so through all the challenges of the last few weeks, there are a number of things that are really kicking us forward. And we're seeing organizations able to listen to people and to make changes and to adapt to this new environment. Graham, the OODA Loop is a great example of how to do that, right? So I think a lot of us right now are trying to get oriented, and it was wonderful to see your comments and really understand where you're coming from. So with that, I think we can kick it to Hunter and Heather. If you guys have collected any questions, we're happy to dive in on those next. And if you're joining us on the phone line, see a number of you there, you can always hit *3, and that'll give you the opportunity to record a quick voice question. It'll get transcribed and pop up on our screen over here. So we'll go with that.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And I'll let you field those, and we can try to quarterback some of them. But if you want to, if you see anything pop up on the voicemail line, feel free. But yeah, if there are written questions, I'll let you manage those, and we'll answer them together.
Sounds good. It's on the Odyssey together, right? The sheer volume of comments has been astounding. It's yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
giving
I think
people a voice.
Yeah, and I think it's an important thing to note, right? That's the response that we need to make as people who help, local governments make decisions. There is a deafening roar of people speaking to these representatives right now about topics that we originally knew were pretty isolated, health, public health, and safety, but then erupting in the midst of that, a critical conversation about police reform and equity. And so now, like we said earlier, those crossroads of career defining challenges. So how do we make sense of the noise? How do we try to catalog those conversations and respond thoughtfully to each concern without getting our messages mixed? So absolutely. Yeah, I'll leave it to you to field any questions if they're in.
Absolutely. So we've got one here from, looks like Colorado, and it's regarding the cost savings quote from the Florida example. What were the cost saving elements that they identified? So I know we had that slide in another our previous webinar, but the savings was from a study that Florida DOT did in tandem with Federal Highway Administration, and was specifically looking at the cost of a public hearing. Now, as a big state transportation agency, they were looking at in-person public hearing costs for some projects being around $50,000. That's obviously a lot bigger than a lot of local governments. But when they were looking at the virtual comparison to that, Graham, I know there was a number of things, but I think it was obviously the consultant hours. Just it takes more time to do an in-person meeting. You have more time on the ground, so staff preparation time. Obviously, there's an increased cost on some things if you're doing more visualizations and that sort of thing. But security, equipment rental, space rental, if that's relevant. For some organizations, you've got free space, but then there's staff time and making sure security are on hand. So, Graham, any other things you can remember from that study?
I am pulling up that slide. They said it was $50,000 for a traditional public hearing and $20,000 for a virtual public hearing. So what we could probably do is ask them if we wanted. I know some of the folks, Rusty down there at Florida DOT, might be happy to explain some of those things in more detail. But we referenced specifically that $50,000 and $20,000 number that they reported to FHWA.
Got it.
Yeah.
And Hunter relayed another question about police reform. So how can we make sure all of our community's voices are heard if we're hosting a conversation primarily online? That's a great point. So I think if we talk to what we covered a little bit today, it's to not have everything online if you can. So if you can provide ways for people to phone in their comments, if you can do traditional like postcard type outreach, that's another way. But Graham, I know we've got a number of clients that are doing police reform surveys actively right now. Virginia Beach, Nashville, I believe as well.
So
get a handle on all
there's
that.
some interesting data along those lines. So the city of Virginia Beach, I actually saw the other day, they had a couple of online engagement initiatives out. One was the COVID-19 reopening survey, and that one had, I want to say this was probably 3 or 4 days ago. It had 8,500 or so respondents, but the police chief recruitment survey, so we're talking about decisions made at the local level that really impact the lives of the people, immediately, right? The mayor, the chief serves at the mayor's, pleasure, right? Had over 30,000 responses. So you can tell just by that the importance of those conversations and what's a priority right now. We were very fortunate to have a panel discussion on Tuesday, on police reform. So we had, and I unfortunately I couldn't watch the whole thing, but it was on the system. Representative from in the House from Colorado, and of course, so Dan from the National Freedom of Information Coalition had gotten those folks together. The Breckner Center down in Florida, and one of the things that they discussed was the need to make sure that the types of ways we go out to those communities, right, are varied. We need to make sure that we invest in the relationships. So when I look at that and I think about the ways technology can help, it's ignore online surveys as like the one way to penetrate. Go and find those community leaders. I've said this before, but find the community leaders who have a voice within those underserved groups, and let them, be your bullhorn, to know that you can trust them to relay the message. That's an important intermediary. And when we talk about technology, right, that's where you track the participation. We know where we're hearing from people, whether it's in a certain community, whether it's in a certain demographic. We need to ask those questions and be intentional about where we market. That's a word we don't say much, marketing these efforts. But I would say, tune in to actually, if you want to hear more on police reform and a specific conversation, I think the recording is hosted at publicinput.com/NFOIC policetransparency.com /NFOIC police transparency. And there's a recording of that conversation.
Yep. And Hunter, if you could drop that link in the public chat for folks, we can just reference that there if you want to watch the conversation on police transparency reform. Let's see. The next one is about statistically valid metrics. How do we know if who we're hearing from is a statistically valid sample? So the nature of the word statistically valid can be a little bit nebulous, depending on if you're doing like an academic research survey, or ultimately the way we look at statistically valid is if we can, from a statistical standpoint, say that there's a 95% confidence interval that you've reached a representative sample. So we do that through a couple different mechanisms. So if you include demographic questions as part of your outreach, whether you're doing that via text message or online or otherwise, we're going to be looking at the demographics of your participants relative to the demographics in your area. So you can compare to see if you've got any gaps in your sample. So the number one thing there is to think about engagement through one or two waves at least. So a first wave of outreach that gives you an initial data set, and then using the comparison with census data, you can understand who have we missed and how do we close that gap. So if there are gaps, at that point, we work with you on strategizing for ways to follow up. For a lot of folks, that's targeted, like geo-targeted social advertising, or as Graham mentioned, partnering with community groups that have access to maybe the community members that you're missing. So once you do that, you can close that gap and ultimately with that, look at a geographic and census-oriented comparison of the data to have a confidence interval that works for your sample. That's a little bit getting into stat world, but for some, that's a really important thing. I think when we look at sensitive issues, that does come up. So I definitely appreciate that question.
Yeah, I'll tag on to that, Jay, and mention that one of the thoughts that that was brought to me, that more doesn't necessarily mean better engagement. So just because you can tout higher numbers doesn't mean you can tout representative or equitable engagement. And that's really where this focus on who you've heard from, and that attributable comment, knowing that you've heard from corners of the community geographically and demographically, are important. So while we love to see big numbers, we love more to see representative numbers, and we have those spider charts that show, right, the response sets based on census data, and heat maps to show response sets based on geographics. So that was brought to me a little while ago, and I thought that more isn't necessarily better is a pretty solid way to say this is a focus, right?
We've got a question from a current client, I think is asking a loaded question, but it's a good thing. We have a lot of folks that aren't as tech savvy, and a lot of teams that are just now getting introduced to virtual meetings. How do we get them up to speed? So for a lot of organizations, the first wave of adapting to a quarantine situation or to a stay-at-home order was to make sure things like the council meetings could be held, or things like the larger boards could virtually meet, and things like the planning commission meeting or rezonings or community commissions, those got pushed further out. We're going to figure this out later. Well, now later is here, and there's a lot of teams that need to meet. So the short answer is practice is always key, but as an organization, we're doing a number of things to try to help with that situation. And I think that's why the question was asked. But so we're creating a series of new training modules specific to virtual meetings. And this past week, we rolled out a new feature called Meeting Coach. And it'll pop up in the admin view of your meeting if there's anything that we notice from a technical perspective that isn't quite right, whether it's forgetting to connect the public conference bridge, or if something's muted when it shouldn't be muted, those sorts of things we're trying to help with. But ultimately, the burden of bringing more of the organization into this new environment, into a virtual world, is not your burden to carry alone. And we take that burden pretty seriously here in terms of how do we train people and build the skills to be able to do public engagement the right way. So if that's something that is a concern for you and you need some help, we're happy to jump in. I know we could probably put up the contact info slide there. Obviously, you could email us at the meeting email that's shown above the meeting, or you can use the info@publicinput.com to get in touch. There's also the handy little chat bot in the corner of the little blue circle. You can chat with a member of our team live at any point to get answers to your questions and figure out next steps for trying to tackle some of these challenges as an organization.
I think we've got one more. Hunter forwarded me one more that may have come in an email, but the best practices, this is, what is the best practice for keeping track of manual efforts such as postcards, as well as digital outreach methods? And so when looking at those online and offline methods, it comes down to database management. One of the things we focus on here is data management, sort of as a best practice, knowing that the current sort of state of affairs is disconnected. We have project managers, we have consulting firms, we have different departments, of course, right? Elected officials and public comment for council meetings. All these are different data silos. And so what we really try to advocate for is a CRM of any variety. Of course, our system has one built in, but a customer relationship management system, a place where all of the people who contribute in any form or fashion to the conversation in your agency are stored, and their profile includes their history of participation, their obviously personal information, so that you can know, right, who you've heard from, where they are, what their background is, that representative aspect. And you can, more importantly, connect the dots with different projects, with different departments, different initiatives. When you look at offline things like postcards, when you send those out, what we personally say is, let's have a short code, right? Like a URL that is unique to that maybe neighborhood. And when people who receive that postcard go to that website or scan that QR code that may be on the postcard, or text in, right? There could be a text message code if you want to provide a variety of things. Each of those is identifiable as that particular neighborhood, so you know what worked and what didn't. So yeah, going back to data management and trackable participation.
That's perfect. Well, thanks, Graham. I think that's probably all we can do for comments and questions for today, but really just happy to be here, and what I appreciate all of you who are able to join us. And if you'd like to share this presentation with anyone on your team, you can actually just grab the URL at the top of the page. As soon as we're done here, YouTube will process the live stream that you've been watching, and it'll be permanently here on the page for you to share and point back to. So it's worth noting that all of us are in a new environment, and we're all working hard to understand it and to make changes to serve people. And if we recognize the importance of this moment in not only our work but history, I think engagement and listening are probably the safest bet on doing what's right by our communities and for society as well. So thank you all for going on that odyssey, that journey with us. And we look forward to continuing the work.
Well, I appreciate you making those comments, Jay. And thank you to everybody again for participating in the survey too. That's it's incredibly important to hear from you, and we'll keep listening. Thanks so much.
All right.